This podcast discusses child sexual abuse and the impacts of harm on children and families. While we won't include graphic detail, some listeners may find this content distressing. Please take care while listening and consider pausing or seeking support if you need to. There's many and varied support services available, including Lifeline on 13 11 14, Kids Helpline for 5 to 25-year-olds on 1800 55 1800, and the Sexual Assault Helpline on 1800 010 120. If you're outside of Australia, we encourage you to seek a local support service. So welcome back to the podcast, Conrad. Really pleased to have you in the chair sharing your thoughts and insights. You have more than 20 years of experience working around the world in child sexual exploitation prevention, victim engagement and child safety. You have more experience than I can imagine to contribute to this conversation, but I'm very grateful for your contribution to the review. Earlier in the series, drawing on your experience, you spoke about the system conditions that allow abuse to occur across many systems in many different countries. From your perspective, which reform recommendations in this specific review is most critical to get right?
Thanks, Kirsten. Good to be back. It's a little bit of a broad answer to your very specific question, but I mean, all the recommendations are fantastic in terms of the need for them. If we're looking at child protection as a layered issue requiring a layered response, all of the recommendations are, of critical importance, certainly for implementation. But I think for me, certainly speaking from my career perspective, one of the biggest inhibitors I see to safeguarding children is lack of information sharing and lack of collaboration. And often the two intersect. And I think when we look at the recommendations that we have there are actually several that sort of speak to that issue. We've got a call in there for an intelligence hub. That's somewhere where you could have a central location coordinating intelligence and information as it comes in, so that it can actually be made sense of. And when we look at that, it intersects really with the need for a child safeguarding entity that actually can sit separate and independent from other systems and other agencies that exist in the sector, so that there is a degree of independence there that can actually provide oversight. I think that's quite critical. So I think any of the recommendations that really deal with how information is looked at, how it's responded to, how it's shared, those for me are probably some of the most critical. When I look at the case that we used to run alongside this review or drive this review, it's very clear that information sharing was a major problem. And there were certainly missed opportunities in sharing information, or people feeling reluctant to share information for fear of any repercussions that might come. So I think for me, certainly in my career, and I've said this many, many times over the years, that it's probably the single biggest inhibitor to getting good outcomes for children and young people when it comes to child protection.
The report is very clear that accountability has often been unclear. From your experience, what does real enforceable accountability look like in practice? And I'm talking beyond policies and practices.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's very easy to come at this one from a punitive perspective and say, oh, well, we need to prosecute, we need to hold people accountable and have penalties for that. Yes, that might be one element to giving a sense of gravity or weight to how important it is. But we actually need to be thinking about a culture of accountability right from the start. And I think a fair amount of that comes from people's education and learning when they're entering the sector. So when we think about the point of entry that somebody comes to work in a child and young person centered service or domain, what are we doing in the education process when they're entering this space, or when they're making the choice for a career that they want to become a teacher, or they want to become an early childcare worker, or they want to work in a government department that deals with child safety. How are we setting that tone and that culture where there is an expectation of accountability, but also we're creating a safe environment for people to be able to challenge?
Mm-hmm.
So in other words, we have a peer accountability in there. Do we feel comfortable enough to challenge each other on our decision making? Are we actually feeling comfortable enough to actually speak up where we see that maybe there's a gap in something, or someone hasn't maybe acted in the best way or in the best interests of the child? So I think creating a culture and an environment and maybe mechanisms where that can actually play out in action is really, really important.
How do you achieve that?
Yeah, again, education. I think that's your starting point. But I think you have to embed that in policy as well, and practice. So what's our mechanism for ensuring accountability? Well, do we have regular supervisions occurring for staff who work in, certainly in child protection related settings, in settings where we've got children with a high level of complexity and vulnerability? What does that supervision for staff and employees look like? Are we having set check-ins with individuals who are working with children and young people? Are we actually exploring their practice? Are we actually helping to develop practice in a constructive and structured way? Or are we being very ad hoc about it? I'm a firm believer that a system shouldn't be dependent on individuals alone. The system should actually be built in a way where it creates mechanisms for those things to happen. So not by chance, but with intention. That for me is really important. I in my career, I've spent quite a bit of time doing clinical supervision with staff in child protection-based settings. And it's a really important mechanism for people to be able to actually talk about concerns that they see, stuff that they're finding challenging in their day-to-day work. And it's interesting because it's often in those sessions that you start to tease out other issues that actually might be a bigger concern, or could potentially turn into a bigger concern. So I think having those mechanisms that start upstream before something becomes a big problem are actually really important in creating an environment of accountability. You're always going to have a punitive end when we use the word accountability in any system. There's always a punitive consequence. But we want to actually be treating accountability as a continuum. It's something that we start with much, much earlier in a process. So we reduce the chance of us having to actually take punitive action when something goes wrong.
We've spoken in other episodes and with some other guests about this concept of shared responsibility. And what I'm reflecting on with what you've just spoken there about that peer ecosystem and that peer network is a way of sharing responsibility for knowledge and for capability building and for expanding the knowledge. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. There's a notion that's been around for a very long time, peer mentoring. How well do we do that? Is that something we need to explore in more detail, where you do have maybe people who have really good practice, who have experience and knowledge? Are we actually utilising that? Are we actually bringing best practice, or even just good practice into a space where that can then rub off on other individuals who are working in that space? Good peer-to-peer mentoring can actually be a really, really useful mechanism for demonstrating in action what good practice looks like. It's also a very useful way for helping people to understand in a, if you like, a non-confrontational way, what conduct should look like, what is expected of them in the work that they do. And I think I think too often what I've seen is a scenario where the system is under so much pressure that not enough time is actually allowed for those processes to play out, for us to actually benefit from good practice and good knowledge. Instead, the rush through to getting people into a position where they can go and work on their own in a certain setting or situation. And we need to actually slow down. And I think this is the problem. We need to actually understand that time is an important factor in building and developing good practice and essentially good teams of staff that operate in child and young person facing services. Everybody's under pressure. We're all time poor, but that's something from a systems perspective that could and should be built in when we're thinking about how we essentially create an environment that works both for workers but also for children ultimately.
Children's safety should never be compromised.
No, absolutely shouldn't.
Turning to the recommendations, so the review sets out a number of really clear and achievable recommendations, but reform often fails at the point of implementation. Based on your experience, what most commonly gets in the way of really good recommendations translating into really good outcomes?
Yeah. In no particular order, politics and priority. And I think... I mentioned earlier the Royal Commission back in over 2015 to 2017 period. What we saw was some really good recommendations. We saw all the states and territories say, yeah, we accept these recommendations. But then what we didn't see was implementation of all the recommendations. And I think the problem we have is when children are not prioritised in our society, and they're not seen as important, meaningful members of society that actually have something to contribute, they're generally viewed quite low down the priority list. And we see this evident in the way governments and political priority plays out. I mentioned previously the need for there to be priority in the establishment of a Minister for Children. So in other words, senior minister position that has sole responsibility for that as a portfolio issue. Not a portfolio that's tagged onto other portfolios, but children being seen as individuals in their own right as a priority. The impact on society is huge. By not prioritising children and caring for children, we actually create problems for us later on down the line, generations down the line. And we've certainly seen this with domestic and family violence. We see it with mental health. So it should be no surprise then that if we're not picking up child protection as a priority issue, that's actually going to feed into bigger problems later on down the line. So I think, politics and priority for me are probably the two big things that stick out in terms of being barriers. If we're really talking about prioritizing, it means we need to talk about investing. So are we meaningfully investing in the future of our children? And that includes the protection and safeguarding of our children. If we're not, then we can't really be in a position later on down the line to question why things haven't gone right or why it's not worked out. We invest in other things extensively, very heavily, no questions asked. When we look at industry, when we look at defence, all of those different areas, we'll see heavy investment. But, and I use defence as an example. Defence is about essentially protection of a nation. So why aren't we protecting children when we think about the way we invest? And some people might say, oh, well, that's a very sort of simplistic way of looking at it. But actually the reality is the cost of not investing is huge. It far outweighs the initial investment. And I think we need to kind of reframe our thinking around what it means when we say prioritize. Are we actually literally putting our money where our mouth is?
Mm-hmm. We're obviously hoping to see many, if not all, of the recommendations implemented. To you, what does success look like in 5 years' time? Should they all be implemented? And the second question to that is, how do you think we should be measuring success?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's always a difficult question to answer because we have a tendency when we're thinking about measuring success, certainly off the back of issues like this, we have a tendency to look for KPIs. So what are our key performance indicators? The problem is that's not really dealing with the human element of it. What we should be looking at is outcomes. And you do generally need a 5 to 10 year period to really actually start to see a shift and a change, certainly around quite significant human sort of social issues. So what I'd be looking for, if I was looking from a KPI perspective, I'd be saying, well, a reduction in offending. Mm-hmm. Australia has massive rates of child sex offending occurring, like huge. So I'd be looking for a reduction in that. But I'd also actually be looking in the long term for other outcome indicators or impact indicators. So a reduction in stress on mental health services. So we know that child sexual abuse victims frequently and often have a huge impact on their adult life in terms of mental health outcomes. So we should start to see impact on some of those areas that aren't automatically viewed within the context of child protection, but are certainly impacted by the world of child protection. So if I was looking for, what success looks like, well, it really does come down to how you measure success, but I would certainly start to look at better outcomes. I think I would expect to see increased service delivery for victims and survivors of child sexual abuse. I would expect to see meaningful funding coming forward to support approaches to disrupting offending behaviour, but also a more consistent approach to funding education and awareness, not just for the community, but also for the professional sector as well. That's a bit of a broad answer, I know, to what was sort of a fairly black and white question, but it's quite difficult when you look at something in a short term that is in reality has a long-term impact. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to reflect on as we wrap up this episode about what needs to change?
Yeah, I think if I was being really sort of pie in the sky in my thinking, I'd like us to start treating children as actual human beings and citizens in society who are an important part of society. I think we talk about what needs to change. We need to change our attitude towards children. We need to value childhood and actually protect and preserve it. And that means that we need to actually change how we deal with children and how we treat children in terms of the issues that pop up for them. So that, for me, yeah. And ultimately, we need to believe children.
Conrad, thank you so much for joining me today. The value that you place in children is undeniable. Your contribution to keeping children safe is profound and admirable, and I'm really grateful that you've spent some time with me this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.